quaint Maplebridge Inn, nestled in the serene Fernley village, a chilling scream shatters the autumn night. Victor Crane, a secretive businessman, lies dead in a locked room, a letter opener in his chest and a cryptic note in his hand. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unravelling secrets. As whispers of blackmail, betrayal and old grudges surface among the inn's eclectic guests, a fiery actress, a gruff major, a reserved doctor, and a nervous maid, Marple sifts through clues, a burned letter, a lavender vial, a hidden cigarette case. In a web of motives, only one truth can unlock the mystery. Will she solve the impossible crime before the killer strikes again? Chapter 1. The Arrival at Fernley Village. The autumn sun hung low over Fernley Village, casting a golden glow across its patchwork of thatched cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window of the 3:15 train from London, watched the countryside unfold with a quiet satisfaction. Her knitting bag, a faithful companion, rested on the seat beside her, its contents clinking softly with each sway of the carriage. She had been summoned by a letter from her old friend, Mrs. Beatrice Langley, whose looping handwriting hinted at unease beneath its cheerful tone. "Come to the Maplebridge Inn, Jane," she had written. "A restful weekend, but there's a curious air here I can't quite place." Miss Marple, ever alert to the subtleties of human nature, had accepted at once. The Maplebridge Inn stood at the edge of Fernley Village, its ivy-clad stone walls and mullioned windows exuding an inviting charm. As Miss Marple alighted from the station, a crisp breeze tugged at her shawl, and she adjusted her hat, a sensible affair adorned with a single feather, before spotting Mrs. Langley waving from a pony trap. Beatrice, a widow in her 60s with a penchant for bright scarves and lively chatter, embraced her warmly. "Jane, you haven't changed a bit, though I dare say Fernley will surprise you. It's not St. Mary Mead, but it has its own secrets." The inn's lounge was a picture of rustic comfort, polished oak beams, a crackling fire, and chintz-covered armchairs. Miss Marple settled into one, her sharp eyes taking in the other guests as Mrs. Langley ordered tea. Major Reginald Forbes, a barrel-chested man with a walrus moustache, sat stiffly in a corner, leafing through a newspaper with evident irritation. His military bearing suggested a life of discipline, yet his frequent glances toward the door betrayed a certain restlessness. Across the room, Miss Clara Henshaw, a young actress with auburn curls and a theatrical laugh, held court with a glass of sherry, her gestures as studied as a stage performance. Mr. Victor Crane, a businessman whose tailored suit spoke of wealth, sat apart, his face shadowed by a furrowed brow. Dr. Lionel Everett, the local physician, leaned against the mantelpiece, his thin frame and guarded expression suggesting a man who preferred observation to conversation. The inn's staff added to the tableau. Mrs. Agnes Whitlock, the proprietress, bustled about with a warm smile, her apron dusted with flour from some unseen culinary task. Her nephew, Tom, a lanky youth with a mop of brown hair, carried luggage with a cheerful whistle. Elsie, the maid, moved silently, her pale face and downcast eyes making her nearly invisible as she tidied the room. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the interplay of glances. Clara's coy smile toward Crane, Forbes's scowl at the actress's laughter, and Everett's subtle frown as he checked his pocket watch for the third time. Dinner was a formal affair, with candlelight glinting off polished silver. Mrs. Whitlock had outdone herself with roast pheasant and a fine claret, though the conversation was stilted. Major Forbes grumbled about the decline of empire, earning a polite nod from Dr. Everett, who seemed more interested in his plate. Clara, seated beside Crane, recounted her latest role in a London review, her voice carrying a touch too much enthusiasm. Crane responded with curt pleasantries, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an interruption. Mrs. Langley, seated next to Miss Marple, murmured, "Victor Crane's been here before, you know. Always so secretive. I wonder what brings him back." After dinner, the party retired to the drawing room, where a grand piano stood unused in one corner. Clara, emboldened by the claret, attempted a song, but faltered when Crane excused himself abruptly, claiming a headache. Major Forbes lit a cigar, filling the room with its pungent aroma, while Dr. Everett opened a medical journal, though his eyes strayed often to the staircase. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, listened as Mrs. Langley leaned close. "Jane, I don't like the feel of this place tonight. It's as if everyone's waiting for something to happen." Her words proved prophetic. At precisely 9:30, a scream shattered the quiet. The guests froze, their faces a gallery of shock and curiosity. Elsie, the maid, appeared at the top of the staircase, her hands clutching the banister, her voice trembling. "It's Mr. Crane! In his room! He's dead!" Major Forbes sprang to his feet, his military instincts taking over, and led the charge upstairs. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her mind already sifting through the evening's observations. Crane's door, at the end of the corridor, was locked. Forbes, with a grunt, shouldered it open, revealing a chilling sight. Victor Crane slumped over his desk, a letter opener protruding from his chest, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. The window was bolted shut, the key still in the lock on the inside. Dr. Everett, pushing past the others, checked for a pulse and shook his head. Dead. Stabbed, I'd say, within the last hour. The room was silent, but for Elsie's stifled sobs and the faint tick of Crane's pocket watch on the desk. Miss Marple, standing just inside the doorway, took in the scene. A glass of brandy, barely touched, beside a crumpled letter in Crane's hand, a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air, and a single chair, slightly askew, as if moved in haste. Constable Harris, summoned from the village, arrived with a notebook and a flustered air, clearly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. As he cordoned off the room, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the letter in Crane's hand, its words just visible. "You cannot hide forever." She felt the familiar stir of curiosity, the sense that beneath the surface of Fernley Village's tranquil inn lay a web of secrets waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 2. The Locked Room. The Maplebridge Inn, so recently a haven of warmth and chatter, now lay under a pall of dread. The discovery of Victor Crane's body had transformed the cosy drawing room into a stage for suspicion, and the guests, huddled in uneasy silence, awaited the arrival of authority. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting untouched, observed the scene with her characteristic clarity. Major Reginald Forbes paced near the window, his heavy footsteps echoing like a metronome. Miss Clara Henshaw, her earlier vivacity extinguished, clutched a handkerchief, her eyes red-rimmed but curiously watchful. Dr. Lionel Everett sat rigidly, his fingers drumming on the armrest of his chair, while Mrs. Beatrice Langley, ever the loyal friend, whispered to Miss Marple, "Jane, this is dreadful. Who could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple only nodded, her mind already turning over the puzzle of the locked room. Constable Harris, a young man whose earnestness outstripped his experience, had secured the corridor leading to Crane's room and was now attempting to assert order. His boyish face, flushed with the weight of responsibility, betrayed his discomfort as he addressed the assembled guests. "No one is to leave the inn until we've sorted this out," he declared, his voice cracking slightly. "Inspector Grayson from Brighthaven will be here soon, but I'll need statements from everyone." His notebook trembled in his hands, and Miss Marple, with a pang of sympathy, noted his resemblance to her nephew's friend, a lad who had once tried to solve a village theft with more zeal than skill. The door to Crane's room, now ajar, revealed a scene frozen in time. Victor Crane remained slumped over his desk, the letter opener glinting cruelly in the lamplight. The room was small but well appointed, with a four-poster bed, a heavy oak desk, and a single window overlooking the garden. The window's bolt was firmly in place, its latch undisturbed, and the key in the door's lock gleamed dully, as if mocking the impossibility of the crime. Miss Marple, permitted to observe as Mrs. Langley's guest, stood just inside the threshold, her eyes cataloguing every detail. The brandy glass, its amber contents barely sipped, caught her attention, as did the crumpled letter in Crane's hand. A faint whiff of lavender perfume hung in the air, elusive yet distinct, and she filed it away for later consideration. Constable Harris, with Dr. Everett's assistance, examined the body. "Stabbed through the heart," Everett said curtly, his professional demeanour strained. "Death would have been near instantaneous, likely between 8 and 9 this evening." Miss Marple noted the time. It was now just past 10. The dinner had ended at 8:30, and the scream had come at 9:30. The window of opportunity was narrow, and the locked door only deepened the mystery. She recalled a case in her youth, where a locked room had been explained by a hidden spring in a wardrobe, but a glance around Crane's room showed no such contrivance. The walls were solid, the floorboards unyielding, and the fireplace too small to conceal a secret passage. Mrs. Langley, hovering anxiously, murmured, "Jane, how could anyone have done this? The door was locked, the window bolted." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her mind elsewhere. "People are ingenious, Beatrice, when they wish to be," she said softly. She approached the desk, where Constable Harris, with a nod, allowed her to inspect the letter in Crane's hand. The paper was creased, as if gripped tightly in his final moments, and bore a single line in a sharp, angular script. "You cannot hide forever. The truth will come out." No signature, no address, only those ominous words. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A threat, perhaps, or a warning, but from whom? The guests were summoned one by one to the lounge for questioning, and Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively, listened as each offered their account. Clara Henshaw, her voice tremulous, claimed she had been in her room rehearsing lines for a new play. "I was alone, practicing my soliloquy," she said, her eyes darting to Major Forbes as if seeking confirmation. Miss Marple noted the actress's flair for drama, wondering if her tears were as rehearsed as her lines. Major Forbes, his voice gruff, insisted he had been in the garden smoking a cigar to clear his head. The scent of tobacco on his jacket supported his claim, but Miss Marple recalled the garden's proximity to Crane's window and made a mental note. Dr. Everett's statement was brief. He had been in the lounge, reading a medical journal, until the scream drew him upstairs. His calm delivery contrasted with the nervous tick in his jaw, and Miss Marple wondered what thoughts lay behind his reserved facade. Mrs. Agnes Whitlock, wringing her hands, confirmed she and her nephew Tom had been in the kitchen, preparing breakfast trays for the morning. "We heard nothing until Elsie screamed," she said, her voice thick with distress. Tom nodded vigorously, his youthful face pale but earnest. Elsie, when questioned, admitted to cleaning the upstairs corridor just before the scream. "I saw no one near Mr. Crane's room," she whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. Miss Marple observed the maid's pallor, her eyes avoiding contact, and felt a flicker of curiosity. As the interviews concluded, Inspector Grayson arrived, a sturdy man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense air. His presence brought a shift in the room, the guests straightening as if under military inspection. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, his gaze lingering on the locked door. "A clever trick, no doubt," he said, his tone dismissive. "Killers always think they can outsmart us with locked rooms and such nonsense. We'll get to the bottom of it." He instructed Constable Harris to guard the room and began his own inquiries, but Miss Marple sensed his focus on mechanics might overlook the human element. She returned to the lounge, where Mrs. Langley pressed her for thoughts. "Jane, it's impossible. No one could have entered or left that room." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a soothing counterpoint to her racing mind. "Impossible is a word I distrust, Beatrice," she said. "In my experience, what seems impossible is often merely clever." She recalled a village scandal years ago, where a locked shed had concealed a theft through a simple sleight of hand. Here, the key in the lock intrigued her. Could it have been manipulated from outside? A string, perhaps, or a tool? The idea was tantalizing, but incomplete. As the night wore on, the inn grew quiet, save for the creak of floorboards and the occasional murmur from the guests. Miss Marple, retiring to her room, paused at the corridor's end, her eyes lingering on Crane's door. The lavender scent, the cryptic note, the untouched brandy, all were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained unclear. She thought of the guests, Clara's theatrical tears, Forbes's restless pacing, Everett's guarded silence, Elsie's nervous glances. Each held a secret, she was certain, and secrets, in her experience, were the threads that unravelled mysteries. Lying in bed, her knitting bag beside her, Miss Marple let her mind drift. Fernley Village, like any small community, was a tapestry of hidden motives: greed, fear, love, revenge. Victor Crane had stirred something dark, and his death was no random act. As sleep claimed her, she resolved to watch closely, for the truth, as it always did, would reveal itself in the small, overlooked details of human behaviour. Chapter 3. Whispers of Motive. The morning after Victor Crane's murder dawned grey and damp, the mist clinging to Fernley Village like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat by her window at the Maplebridge Inn, her knitting needles idle as she gazed at the sodden garden below. The inn, once a beacon of warmth, now felt stifled, its guests moving with the cautious tread of those aware they were under scrutiny. Inspector Grayson's arrival had brought a semblance of order, but Miss Marple knew that order was superficial. Beneath it, motive simmered, waiting to be uncovered. She adjusted her shawl and resolved to take her morning walk. For villages, she knew, spoke their truths in whispers. The high street of Fernley was quiet, save for the clatter of a milk cart and the murmur of locals outside the post office. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and sensible hat, blended easily into the scene, her ears attuned to the gossip that drifted like leaves on the wind. At the counter, Mrs. Potter, the postmistress, was recounting Crane's reputation to a customer. "Not a kind man, that Mr. Crane," she said, her voice low. "They say he drove a partner to ruin years back. Some London deal gone sour." The customer nodded, adding that Crane had been seen in Fernley often, always alone, always secretive. Miss Marple, purchasing a stamp, filed these snippets away, her mind turning over the idea of a past betrayal. Back at the inn, breakfast was a subdued affair. Major Reginald Forbes, his face ruddy from a sleepless night, attacked his bacon with unnecessary vigour, muttering about the inefficiency of the police. Miss Clara Henshaw, pale beneath her rouge, picked at her toast, her eyes flitting nervously to the door. Dr. Lionel Everett was absent, reportedly attending a patient in the village, though Miss Marple noted his absence coincided with Inspector Grayson's latest round of questions. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, seated beside her, whispered, "Jane, this place feels like a powder keg. Everyone's hiding something." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, engaged Mrs. Agnes Whitlock in conversation as the proprietress cleared plates. With gentle probing, she learned that Crane had visited the inn regularly for 3 years, always requesting the same corner room with its view of the garden. "He was particular," Mrs. Whitlock said, her brow creasing. "Once I heard him arguing with a man, late at night, maybe a year ago. Couldn't make out the words, but it was heated." Miss Marple nodded, her mind connecting this to the postmistress's tale of a ruined partner. Could the argument have been with someone in the room now? In the lounge, Miss Marple found Clara Henshaw alone, staring into the fire. The actress, sensing an audience, softened her expression, but could not hide the tension in her hands, twisting a silk scarf. "Miss Henshaw," Miss Marple began, her tone mild, "you must have known Mr. Crane well, staying here so often." Clara's laugh was brittle. "Oh, hardly well. He was charming at first, promised to introduce me to a London producer, but he grew distant, almost cruel." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of resentment in her eyes. "Did he ever mention his business?" she asked. Clara shook her head, but her hesitation suggested more than she admitted. Major Forbes, entering with a scowl, interrupted the exchange. "All this fuss over a man like Crane," he growled, lighting a cigar. Miss Marple, undeterred, remarked casually, "You didn't care for him, Major?" Forbes snorted. "Man was a shark, always scheming, never straight." His hand holding the match trembled slightly, and Miss Marple recalled his restless pacing the previous night. A financial grudge, perhaps. She thought of a retired colonel in her own village whose pride had masked a similar tremor when debts were mentioned. Dr. Everett returned at midday, his face drawn but composed. Miss Marple, encountering him in the hall, commented on the village's charm, easing him into conversation. "You've lived here long, Doctor?" she asked. 10 years, he replied, his tone clipped. "Quiet place, usually." His eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple sensed a wall of reserve. She recalled his frequent glances at his watch during dinner, and wondered if he too had a history with Crane. A casual question about the inn's guests elicited little, but his jaw tightened when Crane's name arose. A detail Miss Marple tucked away. Inspector Grayson, meanwhile, was methodical but frustrated. He had examined the locked room again, finding no hidden mechanisms, and his interviews yielded only vague alibis. At luncheon, the tension broke into open discord. Clara, perhaps emboldened by nerves, accused Forbes of sneaking about the night of the murder. "I saw you near the stairs, Major. Don't deny it," she snapped. Forbes's face reddened. "Mind your own business, girl. Your play acting won't fool anyone." Mrs. Whitlock, serving soup, looked mortified, while Tom, hovering nearby, dropped a spoon with a clatter. Elsie, silent as ever, cleared the table with downcast eyes, her hands unsteady. Miss Marple, observing from her corner, noted Elsie's discomfort. Later, in the quiet of the afternoon, she found the maid polishing silver in the pantry. "Elsie, dear," she said gently, "you must see so much working here." Elsie flushed, her fingers tightening on the cloth. "I just do my job, miss." But under Miss Marple's kind persistence, she admitted to overhearing a conversation 2 nights prior. Mr. Crane and Dr. Everett in the lounge after hours, talking about promises kept or some such. Mr. Crane sounded angry. Elsie's voice faltered, and she excused herself hastily. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind weaving connections. By evening, the inn's atmosphere was electric with unspoken accusations. Inspector Grayson announced he would search Crane's belongings, hoping for a clue to the killer's identity. Miss Marple, invited to sit in as an observer, watched as he uncovered a small notebook in Crane's valise, its pages filled with cryptic numbers and initials. "Could be a code," Grayson muttered, but Miss Marple suspected it was a ledger of debts or blackmail, a tool of Crane's trade. The lavender scent, the burned paper, Elsie's revelation, all pointed to a man whose secrets had made him enemies. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a pretext for thought. Crane's death was no impulsive act. It was the culmination of a grudge, perhaps years in the making. She thought of a spinster in her village, whose quiet demeanour had hidden a fierce loyalty to a wronged friend. Was Elsie's nervousness mere fear, or something deeper? And what of Everett's guarded silence, Forbes's tremor, Clara's resentment? The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the small gestures, the unguarded moments. Tomorrow she would watch closer still, for in Fernley Village, as in all places, human nature held the key to the mystery. Chapter 4. The Clue in the Ashes. The 4th morning at the Maplebridge Inn brought a restless energy to Fernley Village, as if the mist that clung to the hedgerows carried whispers of the unresolved crime. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table with her knitting bag at her feet, observed the guests with her usual quiet acuity. The clink of porcelain and the murmur of strained pleasantries could not mask the undercurrent of unease. Major Reginald Forbes, his newspaper folded tightly, avoided eye contact, while Miss Clara Henshaw, her makeup impeccable despite the early hour, toyed with a silver spoon, her gaze distant. Dr. Lionel Everett, having returned from another early call, sipped his coffee with a distracted air. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, ever Miss Marple's confidant, leaned close. "Jane, it's as if we're all waiting for the other shoe to drop," she murmured. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the empty chair where Victor Crane had sat only days before. Inspector Grayson, undeterred by the previous day's fruitless searches, had taken to examining Crane's room with renewed vigour. Miss Marple, granted permission to observe as Mrs. Langley's friend, followed him upstairs, her steps measured but purposeful. The room, now a shrine to the crime, held the same stark details. The desk, the brandy glass, the letter opener still absent, taken for evidence. Yet it was the fireplace, cold and ashen, that drew her attention. While Grayson inspected the window's bolts for the third time, Miss Marple knelt by the hearth, her gloved fingers sifting through the ashes. Amid the grey dust, she found fragments of burned paper, their edges curled like autumn leaves. With care, she pieced them together on a sheet of blotting paper, revealing partial words: debt repaid L.E. The handwriting, sharp and precise, matched the cryptic note found in Crane's hand. You cannot hide forever. The truth will come out. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She showed the fragments to Mrs. Langley, who had joined her, whispering, "Jane, what does it mean?" Miss Marple replied softly, "It means, Beatrice, that Mr. Crane was settling accounts, but not all were financial." She refrained from sharing her find with Grayson, sensing his preference for her tangible clues over the subtleties of human intent. Instead, she tucked the blotting paper into her reticule, resolving to ponder its significance later. At luncheon, the guests' tension surfaced in sharp exchanges. Clara, her voice edged with defiance, remarked to Forbes, "You've been awfully quiet, Major. Did Mr. Crane owe you something too?" Forbes's face darkened, his fork clattering against his plate. "Watch your tongue, young lady. Your theatrics don't impress me." His bluster, Miss Marple noted, held a note of fear, like a shopkeeper in her village who had once denied a debt too vehemently. Dr. Everett, intervening with a forced smile, changed the subject to the weather, but his eyes flicked toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. Elsie, serving the meal, dropped a tureen lid when Grayson mentioned the burned paper, her face paling. Miss Marple, watching closely, recalled Elsie's earlier admission of overhearing Crane and Everett argue about promises. In the afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Whitlock in the inn's kitchen, where the scent of baking bread offered a fleeting sense of normalcy. Over a cup of tea, she gently steered the conversation to Crane's habits. "He was a private man," Mrs. Whitlock said, kneading dough with vigour, "always burning letters in his fireplace, as if he didn't trust the post. I once saw him toss a whole bundle in, muttering about debts settled." Miss Marple nodded, her mind linking this to the fragments she'd found. Had Crane been destroying evidence of his schemes, or protecting someone else's secrets? Later, in the privacy of her room, Miss Marple examined the burned fragments again. The initials L.E. suggested Dr. Everett, but she cautioned herself against hasty conclusions. In her experience, initials could be misleading, like the time a village girl's diary had implicated the wrong suitor. Yet the connection to Everett's argument with Crane, as reported by Elsie, was compelling. She resolved to speak with the maid again, sensing Elsie's nervousness held more than fear of the crime. Finding Elsie in the corridor, polishing brass fixtures, Miss Marple adopted her most disarming tone. "Elsie, you must hear so much in a place like this," she said, her needles clicking softly. Elsie's hands faltered, and she nodded. "I try not to, miss, but voices carry." Pressed gently, she revealed more about the argument she'd overheard. It was late, 2 nights before it happened. Mr. Crane said something about old promises broken, and Dr. Everett sounded upset, saying he'd paid enough. I didn't stay to hear more. Her eyes darted away, and Miss Marple sensed a reluctance, as if Elsie feared betraying someone. As evening descended, Miss Marple sat in the lounge, her knitting a shield for her thoughts. The burned paper, the lavender scent, the locked door, all pointed to a calculated act, not a crime of passion. She recalled a case in her youth, where a burned letter had concealed a blackmailer's identity, only to be undone by a single careless phrase. Here, the phrase "debt repaid" suggested Crane had been closing old chapters. But whose? Everett's guarded demeanour, Forbes's tremor, Clara's resentment, all were threads in a tapestry of motive. Inspector Grayson, joining the guests for tea, announced his intention to question the staff more closely. "Someone in this inn knows more than they're saying," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. Miss Marple, stirring her tea, considered the perfume vial she'd found under Crane's desk the previous day. Its lavender scent matched Clara's, but Elsie's access to all rooms made her a plausible courier. Had Clara been in Crane's room, arguing over broken promises, or was the vial a deliberate misdirection? Miss Marple thought of a village seamstress who had once planted a rival's hairpin to deflect suspicion. Human nature, she mused, was predictable in its cunning. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's mind turned to the locked room itself. The key, still in the lock, intrigued her. She recalled a trick from a long-ago mystery, where a string had been used to pull a key into place from outside. Could such a method work here? The door's heavy oak and sturdy lock suggested otherwise, but she resolved to test the idea discreetly. For now, she watched the guests. Forbes's forced joviality, Clara's calculated charm, Everett's tense silence, Elsie's fleeting glances. Each held a piece of the truth, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, knew it was only a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. Chapter 5. A Revelation in the Garden. The 5th day at the Maplebridge Inn dawned with a brittle clarity, the mist having lifted to reveal Fernley Village's patchwork fields under a pale October sun. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the rhythms of human behaviour, sensed the mounting strain among the inn's guests. The dining room, where breakfast was served, buzzed with unspoken accusations, the clatter of cutlery, a thin veneer over the tension. Major Reginald Forbes, his moustache bristling, muttered about the incompetence of Inspector Grayson's investigation. Miss Clara Henshaw, her eyes shadowed from sleeplessness, forced a smile as she buttered her toast, while Dr. Lionel Everett, unusually silent, stared into his tea as if it held answers. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, seated beside Miss Marple, whispered, "Jane, it's like living in a cage with wild beasts. Everyone's watching everyone else." Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, nodded thoughtfully. The burned paper fragments, the lavender-scented vial, and Elsie's nervous revelations had woven a complex web, but the locked room remained the knot at its centre. She resolved to explore the inn's garden, for the outdoors, she knew, often revealed what indoor politeness concealed. After breakfast, she donned her coat and hat, her unassuming figure blending into the morning light as she strolled toward the garden's neatly trimmed hedges. The garden, bordered by a low stone wall, offered a clear view of the inn's rear, including the window of Victor Crane's room. Miss Marple paused by a bed of late-blooming roses, her eyes tracing the path from the window to the gravel walk below. It was here she encountered Tom, the porter, raking leaves with a vigour that suggested more than routine diligence. "Good morning, Tom," she said, her tone warm but probing. "You must know every corner of this garden." Tom, his cheeks flushed, nodded. "Aye, miss. Been working here since I was a lad." Under her gentle questioning, Tom grew talkative, perhaps relieved to speak of mundane matters. "I was out here that night, clearing up before the rain," he said. "Saw Major Forbes near Mr. Crane's window, smoking his cigar. Odd, though, he dropped something shiny, then looked about like he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Shiny, you say? Did you find it?" Tom shook his head. "Looked for it later, but it was gone." She thanked him, her mind turning to Forbes's claim of a casual smoke in the garden. A man did not drop valuables carelessly, she thought, recalling a village grocer who had lost a watch to hide his presence at a theft. Determined to investigate, Miss Marple wandered the path beneath Crane's window, her eyes scanning the ground. Near a cluster of lavender bushes, she spotted a glint in the soil. Kneeling with care, she unearthed a small silver cigarette case, its surface engraved with the initials RF. Her lips pursed slightly. It was Forbes's, no doubt, and its burial suggested intent. She tucked it into her reticule, resolving to confront the Major discreetly. Returning to the inn, Miss Marple found Forbes in the lounge, polishing his boots with a vigour that matched his earlier bluster. "Major Forbes," she began, her voice mild, "I believe this belongs to you." She produced the cigarette case, watching his reaction closely. His face reddened, and for a moment his military composure faltered. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, then caught himself. "Must have dropped it days ago. Careless of me." His eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hand, much like a village squire she'd known, caught in a lie about a poaching incident. "Did you drop it the night Mr. Crane died?" she asked gently. Forbes bristled. "I told you, I was in the garden smoking, nothing more." But his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple sensed a deeper connection to Crane, one he was loath to admit. She let the matter rest, knowing pressure would only deepen his guard. Meanwhile, Inspector Grayson had uncovered a new clue. A telegram in Crane's luggage, addressed to Dr. Everett, reading, "Do not trust her." The pronoun was ambiguous, but suspicion fell on Clara, whose flirtations with Crane had been the talk of the inn. Grayson, questioning her in the dining room, pressed for details. Clara, her composure fraying, admitted to a brief romance with Crane months prior. "He promised to help my career," she said, her voice catching. "But he laughed when I asked about it later, said I was naive." Her bitterness was palpable, and Miss Marple, listening from a corner, wondered if betrayal had driven her to more than tears. Elsie's behaviour, however, continued to intrigue Miss Marple. The maid, clearing tea trays, avoided the guest's eyes, her hands trembling as she worked. Miss Marple recalled the lavender vial and Elsie's access to all rooms. Could she have planted it to implicate Clara? Or was her nervousness tied to something else? Seeking answers, Miss Marple engaged Elsie in the hallway, her tone as soothing as a vicar's wife. "Elsie, you must see so much, moving about quietly as you do," she said. Elsie flushed, her fingers twisting her apron. "I don't mean to, miss. I just hear things." Pressed gently, she admitted to seeing Clara near Crane's room the evening before the murder, looking upset, like she'd been crying. But her hesitation suggested more, and Miss Marple sensed a loyalty, perhaps to another guest. As evening fell, Grayson gathered the guests to discuss the telegram. "Someone here knew Crane's secrets," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This her could be the key." Clara's face flushed, but she remained silent, while Everett's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the floor. Forbes, lighting another cigar, scoffed. "You're chasing shadows, Inspector." Miss Marple, knitting quietly, thought of the cigarette case, the telegram, and Elsie's guarded words. Each clue pointed to a web of grudges, but the locked room's secret eluded her. That night, as the inn settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by her window, her needles clicking softly. The cigarette case confirmed Forbes's presence near Crane's room, contradicting his alibi. The telegram suggested Crane's distrust, possibly of Clara, but Everett's reaction hinted at his own involvement. Elsie's knowledge, meanwhile, was a thread yet to be fully pulled. Miss Marple recalled a village scandal where a hidden letter had exposed a servant's loyalty to a guilty master. Was Elsie protecting someone, or had she acted alone? The lavender scent, the burnt paper, the locked door, all were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her patient clarity, knew the truth lay in their alignment. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The 6th day at the Maplebridge Inn bore down on Fernley Village with a weight that seemed to press against the very walls. The air was thick with suspicion, each guest moving as if under a microscope, their glances sharp and guarded. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the lounge with her knitting bag at her side, observed the subtle shifts in demeanour. Major Reginald, Forbes's forced heartiness, Miss Clara Henshaw's brittle smile, Dr. Lionel Everett's withdrawn silence. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, ever her confidant, murmured, "Jane, it's as if the inn itself is holding its breath. Something must give." Miss Marple nodded, her needles idle, her mind weaving together the threads of the cigarette case, the telegram, and Elsie's halting revelations. The locked room, she knew, was not just a physical puzzle, but a mirror to the tangled motives within. Inspector Grayson, his patience fraying, announced a thorough search of the guests' rooms, determined to unearth any hidden clues. The announcement, made over a tense breakfast, drew sharp reactions. Forbes's scowl deepened, Clara's hand trembled on her teacup, and Everett's eyes narrowed, though he said nothing. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted Elsie's quick retreat to the kitchen, her apron clutched tightly. The maid's unease, she thought, was more than fear of authority. It hinted at a secret she was desperate to keep. The search began at noon, with Grayson and Constable Harris moving methodically through the inn. Miss Marple, invited to observe as a courtesy to Mrs. Langley, followed at a discreet distance. In Dr. Everett's room, tucked inside his medical bag, Grayson found a letter, its edges worn as if handled often. The handwriting was Crane's, its tone accusatory. "You thought you could bury our past, Lionel, but I know the truth. Pay, or it comes out." Everett, summoned to explain, stood rigid, his face pale but composed. "It's from years ago," he said, his voice low. "Crane and I were at university together. A failed investment. He blamed me, though we both lost everything. He's held it over me ever since, demanding money." His eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, and she saw a flicker of shame, like a village doctor she'd known, caught in a youthful indiscretion. Grayson pressed further, but Everett insisted, "I didn't kill him. I wanted him gone, not dead." His denial was firm, yet Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, as if he bore a heavier burden than blackmail. The letter, she thought, confirmed Crane's predatory nature. But did it point to Everett as the killer, or merely another victim? In Clara's room, the search yielded little beyond script and costume sketches, but her reaction was telling. When Grayson questioned her about the telegram, "Do not trust her," she crumpled, tears streaming down her face. "He was cruel," she sobbed. "Victor promised me a role in a West End play, but when I pressed him, he threatened to expose my past. I stole some jewelry years ago, nothing big, but he knew." Her confession, raw and unscripted, silenced the room. Miss Marple, listening quietly, recalled a village girl whose petty theft had been used to manipulate her for years. Clara's motive was clear, but her tears seemed genuine. Or were they another performance? Major, Forbes's room offered no new clues, only a collection of military medals and a well-worn pipe. Yet his bluster when questioned faltered. "Crane cheated me in a deal 10 years back," he admitted, his voice gruff. "Lost my savings, but I'm no murderer." His eyes darted to the cigarette case, now in Grayson's possession, and Miss Marple sensed his fear of exposure. A grudge, she thought, could fester into something darker, like a feud in her village that had ended in violence over a mere acre of land. Elsie, though not a guest, was questioned about her movements. Her answers were halting, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I was cleaning, sir, like I said," she murmured. Miss Marple, standing nearby, noted the maid's trembling hands, and wondered if her loyalty to someone, perhaps Everett, had driven her to act. The lavender vial, the burned letter, the cigarette case, all pointed to a convergence of motives, but the locked room remained the enigma. That afternoon, Miss Marple tested a theory. She asked Mrs. Whitlock for a spare key to a similar room, and examined its lock, a sturdy mechanism common to old inns. With a piece of string and a hairpin, she experimented, attempting to pull the key into place from outside. The effort failed, the lock too tight, but the exercise clarified her thinking. The killer, she reasoned, had used a simpler method, perhaps manipulating the key before leaving. She recalled a case in her youth, where a wire had been used to secure a latch, and resolved to inspect Crane's door again. In the evening, Miss Marple orchestrated a subtle test. She asked Elsie to demonstrate the inn's locking routine, claiming curiosity about its old-fashioned keys. Elsie, flustered, fumbled with the key to a guest room, her fingers betraying a familiarity with the mechanism that went beyond routine cleaning. "You're quite adept, Elsie," Miss Marple said kindly, but her eyes were sharp. Elsie's blush and hurried excuse confirmed a suspicion. The maid knew more about locks than she admitted. As night fell, the inn's atmosphere grew oppressive, the guests retreating to their rooms like actors exiting a stage. Miss Marple, in her armchair by the fire, let her knitting lie untouched. The letter in Everett's bag, Clara's confession, Forbes's grudge, Elsie's dexterity, all were pieces of a puzzle. But the locked room held the key. She thought of a village scandal where a servant's devotion had led to betrayal, and wondered if Elsie's loyalty to Everett, or another, had pushed her to act. The truth, she felt, was close, but one final clue was needed to unlock the mystery. Chapter 7. The Truth Unlocked. The seventh evening at the Maplebridge Inn descended with a quiet that felt more like a held breath than a reprieve. The guests, worn by days of suspicion, gathered in the drawing room under Inspector Grayson's stern directive, their faces a gallery of unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the hearth, with her knitting bag untouched, observed the scene with her usual clarity. Major Reginald Forbes's rigid posture, Miss Clara Henshaw's nervous fidgeting, Dr. Lionel Everett's guarded silence. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, beside her, whispered, "Jane, it's unbearable. Surely you've seen something we've missed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, but she said only, "Patience, Beatrice. The truth has a way of showing itself." Inspector Grayson, his patience eroded by the locked room enigma, stood at the room's centre, his notebook bristling with notes. "We've motives aplenty," he declared, "but no clear path to the killer. Tonight we'll lay it all bare." His gaze swept over the guests, lingering on Elsie, who hovered near the door, her hands twisting in her apron. Miss Marple, her mind a tapestry of clues, the cigarette case, the burned letter, the lavender vial, the telegram, felt the pieces aligning. She rose, her voice gentle but commanding attention. "If I may, Inspector, I believe I can clarify matters." The room stilled as Miss Marple began, her tone as unassuming as a village gossip's. Victor Crane's death was no accident, nor the work of a single grudge. It was a convergence of fears and secrets, but one hand struck the blow. She turned to Clara. "Miss Henshaw, you were in Mr. Crane's room that evening, were you not? The lavender scent, your scent, was unmistakable." Clara flushed, her hands clutching her handkerchief. "I argued with him, yes," she admitted. "He mocked me, said my career was a fantasy, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes shifting to Forbes. "Major, your cigarette case, found near Crane's window, places you there, despite your claim of a casual smoke. You had reason to hate him, didn't you? A swindle that cost you dearly." Forbes's face reddened, but he growled, "I didn't stab the man. I wanted to thrash him, perhaps, but not murder." His bluster, Miss Marple noted, held a ring of truth, like a village squire she'd known who blustered to hide shame. She turned to Everett. "Doctor, Crane's letter accused you of a shared past, a failed venture turned to blackmail. You were desperate to be free of him." Everett's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I paid him for years to keep silent, but I swear I didn't kill him." His voice, raw with exhaustion, carried conviction, yet Miss Marple sensed a deeper guilt, not of murder, but of something unspoken. Finally, her gaze settled on Elsie. "Elsie, you know more than you've told. Your skill with the locks, your presence in the corridor, your knowledge of Dr. Everett's troubles." The maid's eyes widened, her hands trembling. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but relentless. "Crane was blackmailing Dr. Everett, wasn't he? You overheard their argument, saw his cruelty. You love the doctor, don't you? Enough to protect him at any cost." Elsie's face crumpled, a sob escaping her. "I couldn't let him ruin Dr. Everett," she cried. "He was a good man, always kind to me. Crane was a monster, threatening to tell everyone about some old mistake. I went to his room to plead with him, but he laughed, said he'd destroy us both. I grabbed the letter opener. It was so quick, I didn't mean—" Her voice broke, and the room froze. Miss Marple explained, her tone measured. Elsie entered Crane's room under the guise of cleaning. After the stabbing, she used a thin wire slipped through the keyhole to pull the key back into the lock from outside, creating the illusion of a sealed room. The burned letter was Crane's attempt to destroy his blackmail evidence, but Elsie acted first. She produced the vial of lavender perfume. This, I believe, was dropped in haste, perhaps to point suspicion at Miss Henshaw. Grayson, stunned but quick to act, took Elsie into custody, her sobs echoing as she was led away. The guests dispersed, their faces a mix of relief and shock. Everett, his shoulders slumped, approached Miss Marple. "I didn't know she'd go so far," he murmured. "I should have stopped him myself." Miss Marple patted his arm, her expression kind but firm. "We cannot undo others' choices, Doctor. Only learn from them." As the fire died in the grate, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind already turning to the quiet of her departure. The truth, as always, had lain in the small details. The nervous glance, the misplaced scent, the too familiar key. Fernley Village would talk of this for years. But for Miss Marple, it was simply another chapter in the endless story of human nature. Chapter 8. The Quiet Departure. The morning of Miss Jane Marple's departure from the Maplebridge Inn broke with a gentle clarity, the October sun casting long shadows across Fernley Village's cobblestone lanes. The inn, though still standing in its ivy-clad charm, seemed diminished, as if the revelation of Elsie's crime had drained its warmth. The guests, now free of the cloud of suspicion, moved with a subdued air, their conversations hushed over breakfast. Major Reginald Forbes, his bluster softened, read his newspaper with less vigour. Miss Clara Henshaw, her theatricality muted, packed her bags with a quiet determination to leave for London. Dr. Lionel Everett, his face etched with a lingering sorrow, spoke little, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, ever loyal, sat beside Miss Marple, her eyes bright with admiration. "Jane, you've done it again," she said softly. "How do you see what we all miss?" Miss Marple, her knitting bag packed and her sensible hat adjusted, smiled faintly. "It's no great trick, Beatrice. People are much the same, whether in Fernley or elsewhere. Their fears, their loves, their secrets, they leave traces, like footprints in a garden." Her voice was gentle, but her mind lingered on the tragedy. Elsie's desperate act, born of devotion, and the web of grudges that had ensnared Victor Crane. She thought of a village girl she'd known, whose loyalty to a wayward brother had led to a similar ruin, and felt a pang of sympathy for the maid now facing justice. Inspector Grayson, preparing to depart with his reports, approached Miss Marple with a rare deference. "Miss Marple, your insight was invaluable," he said, his weathered face softening. "That wire trick, simple, yet devilishly clever. I'd have missed it." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression modest. "You'd have found it, Inspector, given time. I merely noticed what was already there." She did not mention the hours spent piecing together the lavender vial, the burned letter, the cigarette case, each a thread in the tapestry she'd unravelled. Mrs. Agnes Whitlock, bustling about with a tray of scones, paused to thank Miss Marple. "You've saved the inn's reputation in a way," she said, her eyes misty. "We'll recover thanks to you." Miss Marple demurred, but noted the proprietress's resilience, much like a village baker who had weathered a scandal with quiet strength. Tom, the porter, offered to carry her bag to the station, his usual cheer tempered by the week's events. "Never thought Elsie had it in her," he murmured. And Miss Marple, with a kind nod, saw in him the innocence of youth, untouched by the darker currents she'd uncovered. As the train whistle sounded in the distance, Miss Marple took a final stroll through the inn's garden, her eyes lingering on the lavender bushes where the cigarette case had been found. The scene was peaceful now, the roses nodding in the breeze, but she knew Fernley Village would carry the tale of the Maplebridge tragedy for years. She thought of Crane, a man whose greed had sown the seeds of his own destruction, and of Elsie, whose love had driven her to a desperate act. Human nature, she mused, was a garden of both beauty and thorns. At the station, Mrs. Langley embraced her warmly. "Come back soon, Jane, but perhaps under happier circumstances," she said, her voice catching. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I shall, Beatrice, if only for your excellent tea." As the train pulled away, she settled into her seat, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The countryside unfolded beyond the window, and her thoughts turned to her own garden, its roses awaiting her care. The Maplebridge Inn would fade into memory, but its lesson, that truth lies in the quiet details, would remain as clear and enduring as the click of her needles.